We know that despotic forms of government dismiss the significance and value of individual human lives. Today, we'll explore some implications of a government's dismissal of the right to life. In this edition of Life Matters with Brian Johnston. Brian Johnston is the Western Director of the National Right to Life Committee. He has served in many capacities while advocating for innocent lives. As California Commissioner on Aging, as Chairman of the California Pro-Life Council, on the board of the National Legal Center for the Medically Dependent and Disabled. He is an author and lecturer, a film producer, and commentator. And now, here's our host, Brian Johnston.
Hi, I'm Brian Johnston, and I'm your host of Life Matters, your program on life, culture, and the battle of ideas. In this particular broadcast, we're going to go over some of the more foundational elements, but I think they're very important. This is a special podcast you can only get through our podcast. It's not going out over the radio airwaves. So I want to remind you that the purpose of Life Matters is to equip you for the battle of ideas and to get you involved as a co-warrior in this very important battle. And you can join us by calling our 800 number, 800-924-2490, where you can ask questions, you can bring up topics, you can actually offer suggestions for some of our knottier problems and some of the word challenges we have. It's called Wordsworth, where we examine the semantic shifting that goes on in this battle and how language is used against human beings very subtly. And we'd love your input on that. Today, we're going over a lot of stuff. We're going to talk about the word of the year from the Oxford English Dictionary for 2016. It's quite fascinating because it reveals so much about our challenges that we're in the middle of right now as a culture. We're going to talk about things like the importance of feelings and the importance of putting them in the right place. I'm going to spend a little time talking about language. You need to know this about me. I taught for many years on just about every level. My favorite was the grade school level, but I taught English, Latin, and English literature and in high school. And I had my undergraduate in linguistics. So I've got a fondness for language because language is the way that we get ideas across. So we're going to spend some time on how that works and why you need to pay attention to the language. We're going to talk spiritual things too. You know, Mark Twain had a saying, I think it's a good one. He said, "What's a classic? It's a book that everyone thinks should be read, but hardly anyone does." And what that means is that we hardly ever read what is really, really important. And one of the most important, I believe, is the Bible. Now, if you're a Christian, you can think, well, I'm a Christian, so I already know that. But being a Christian is much more than simply going to church. There's some requirements, and a lot of those requirements are, in fact, in the realm of ideas and the kind of ideas you allow into your head. We're going to talk about that specifically, and the kind of, if you will, the language we allow in our head, what we adopt as our worldview, what we hold in our heart. And in the scriptures, when it talks about heart, it's not talking about your cardioid arteries and heart disease. Your heart is the deepest part of your thoughts, what you really cherish. You have to guard it with all diligence because out of it comes the issues of life. So we'll talk about that. I think it's a significant thing. We're going to talk about eternal things, and we'll talk about some movies. By the way, our show notes, we always have show notes on our podcast site, and I want to recommend that you always go to those because we don't have enough time to fully explore the issues that are brought up. We're going to talk about a movie that came out at the end of 2016, Arrival. We're going to talk about some aspects of film and entertainment, and in nearly every program, we make reference to films, to music, to books, and we give you links to those so you can get wired in and get a sense of what's coming at us as a culture. But I think you'll enjoy Arrival if you haven't seen it. I'm going to emphasize some particularly important aspects of it. We're going to talk about China. China is a huge, huge cultural enemy. We used to think China is still communist, and China is doing something in 2017 I'm not sure a lot of people are aware of. We're going to talk about how China is out to influence life and culture. I'm also going to talk a little bit about the Chinese language, and I hope you enjoy that. So we have a lot to cover right now. And so What I'd like you to do is sit back and enjoy. Again, this is Brian Johnston. The program is Life Matters, where we talk about the issues of life, culture, and the battle of ideas. You know, the Oxford English Dictionary for 2016 declared the word of the year was a hyphenated word. The word is post-truth. Post-truth is an adjective that was frequently used in 2016 to describe a situation where emotions were considered more viable than facts. That emotions were considered the appropriate decision-making factor other than facts. And this is a phenomenon that I think was quite appropriate for Word of the Year because of the kind of decisions that we're seeing as a culture. I'll just give you one in passing, but to me it seems self-evident, and yet facts are not what were the determining factor. A multiple Olympic champion in the decathlon, a gentleman emotionally felt that he was now a woman. And I literally have seen that covered, and I've seen him referred to as a woman. He never even got an operation, by the way. He simply emotionally feels he's a woman and renamed himself and casts himself as a woman. And there's many people who want to emotionally support that and concur that he is now a woman. I just have to tell you, that's objectively just not true. He biologically, every cell in his body proclaims that he has a Y chromosome. The man, he didn't have an operation. I'm not sure if he's taking hormones, but it does sum up, as do many other events. You may even know people in your life that prefer their emotion to reality. They would rather depend on their emotions to come to important decisions than look at objective reality. This is so important that you recognize this war, because in the battle of life, there are some important decisions that come up. And if we're not prepared for those, we're going to be talked into doing some very dangerous things. I know whenever I've made a mistake in my life, and I've made mistakes, it's been based on my emotions. So emotions can lead us to do things that are drastic, and sometimes they're the wrong thing. In 2015 in California, the laws were changed because a pretty young woman wanted to kill herself. And now in California, the laws have been changed. Up until that time, the icon for the assisted suicide movement was an unpleasant, emotionally ungratifying gentleman by the name of Jack Kevorkian. He didn't make you emotionally attached. But Brittany Maynard was cute and pretty and sweet, and she wanted to die. And so the emotions were played very, very heavily. We were told it was a family decision. And who are we to invade that? And yet, on the contrary, this was the most public suicide in American history. And that suicide was dragged out for 3 months and marketed in every newspaper in America. You'll find out that it was the George Soros money that paid for that millions of dollars went in to market the emotion of that young woman to millions of Americans for the specific purpose of changing the law. Well, you're not going to hear the stories of the many others who are now dead and are at risk of being killed by family members who are emotionally distraught, or perhaps could be heirs, or think they're doing the right thing. Emotions are incredibly dangerous. We're going to be right back in just a moment. We're going to talk about some of these other things that'll prepare you for this battle of ideas.
You're listening to Life Matters with Brian Johnston.
Well, hi. I just wanted to thank you for joining me. You know, I have good friends, children, young adults, and adults that have Down syndrome. And they are so loved. Their parents love them so much because they're the happiest people you'd ever want to know. I really love them. I'm going to tell you something, though, that's rather frightening. The government of France has now prohibited showing positive images of Down syndrome children and letting parents know how lovable they are. That's an actual law in France. Here in the U.S., 80-some-odd% of Down syndrome kids are killed by abortion before they're born. In France, it's 96%. So we're not a whole lot better. If you'd like to help out, you can go to the National Down Syndrome Society, ndss.org, to help out. That's ndss.org. We really are in a battle of ideas, and lives really are at stake.
And now back to more Life Matters with Brian Johnston.
Welcome back. This is Brian Johnston again. We've been talking about the power of emotions, what the Oxford English Dictionary declared to be the operative word or the predominant significant word of 2016, and that was post-truth, where emotions are the decision maker and not facts. But there's a lot of other things that are going on right now and the battle that you're involved in right now that you need to be aware of. There was a great movie in 2016, and it's been nominated for several awards, the movie Arrival. I'll only talk about one aspect. Many will see it as a science fiction film. I think it was a film about language, and I am quite fond of language. My undergraduate degree was in linguistics. I taught Latin and English, and what Arrival talks about in many ways is language. And one of the points, I won't tell you the whole plot, but if you see it, I think you'll recognize this and realize it gets a little bit deeper than just foreign alien monsters. It underscores how our language impacts our view of time and our view of place, and how we view the temporal world and what's important to us based on the ideas we allow in our head, and that we're somehow cut off from other aspects of time that's beyond us. And the consequences are interesting. And again, I think you'll enjoy it if you look at this film. But let me say this about time and the temporal world. We are living in the time-space continuum, but we are living in eternity right now. Time is actually within eternity. So eternal things have greater consequence than temporal things. And that's what Paul says in several places, but I said in Romans 12:2 that we want to renew our minds so what really matters. And the temporal world can distract us and give us the wrong ideas. So we need to renew our minds. We need to be ready for that battle when it comes upon us so we have the right perspective. But just to be clear about the nature of time, we're limited, just as if you live in Stockton, California. Yes, that's where you are, but you don't have to go to Washington, D.C. to be in the United States. While you're in Stockton, you're still in the United States. And in a sense, while you are in time right now, you're still in eternity. This is part of eternity. And so there's a perspective you want to bring to bear, the things that really matter in life, because you've been given life by someone who's also made eternity. And so that perspective is critically important, and believe it or not, that's kind of communicated in this movie, Arrival, that there's bigger issues that the principal characters forget about and don't fully understand. And you're the principal character in your movie. You're the principal character in what's going on, in the challenges you're facing. And you need to make sure that you have a deeper and broader understanding of what the issues really are. So we talk about the importance of film and entertainment and social media and cultural aspects that impact our thinking that we need to re-examine. I know that I need to re-examine these influences in my life, and it helps a lot when we look at them from the long-range picture. In 2017, China made an announcement that it was going to change how it communicates with the rest of the world. And they declared, and in our show notes you can see the article, it's quite interesting, but they declared that they're going to have a new assertive round of propaganda by which they give their message to the world. Now, as you know, they're still a communist country, but they have decided they're going to have a soft power media push. Soft power media. And by that, they proclaim they have 6 new television stations. Those stations are not going to be broadcasting in their language. They're going to be broadcasting in yours. They're going to have social media outreach. They understand that propaganda is most effective when it's soft. But this should give you pause. Because if they're marketing, if they are propagandizing through these tools, you've already been listening to soft media. You're being propagandized, if you will, right now, because propaganda means to propagate ideas. You're being propagandized every day by the major media, by news outlets. And there's a way of seeing things that you're being encouraged to follow. And as Oxford English Dictionary points out, often it's based only on emotions. How can you be convinced emotionally to believe something in particular? Emotions are often trumping facts. So it's important that we guard your heart. And again, your heart is your most inward and cherished thoughts. That's not talking about your arteries and your ventricles. It's talking about what you really think, what you really care about. And we're being adjured to guard your heart with all diligence, because out of it come the issues of life.
Life Matters continues after this.
Well, hi. I just wanted to thank you for joining me. You know, I have good friends, children, young adults, and adults that have Down syndrome. And they are so loved. Their parents love them so much because they're the happiest people you'd ever want to know. I really love them. I'm going to tell you something, though, that's rather frightening. The government of France has now prohibited showing positive images of Down syndrome children and letting parents know how lovable they are. That's an actual law in France. Here in the U.S., 80-some-odd% of Down syndrome kids are killed by abortion before they're born. In France, it's 96%. So we're not a whole lot better. If you'd like to help out, you can go to the National Down Syndrome Society, ndss.org, to help out. That's ndss.org. We really are in a battle of ideas, and lives really are at stake.
And now back to more about life, culture, and the battle of ideas with Brian Johnston.
Well, welcome back to Life Matters. So now we're in a situation that it is considered ethical and appropriate that if you wish, you can actually take someone who's seriously ill and ethically poison or intentionally kill them. That intentionally killing a patient is now a form of compassion. Without getting too detailed, the Latin compassion has the opposite meaning. Compassion means to suffer with someone, to, in a sense, help bear their burden. Killing them is the opposite of compassion. You no longer have to bear their suffering. You no longer have to comfort them or ease their pain in the appropriate use of medicine. We've been convinced as a culture, based almost entirely on emotions, that it's now appropriate if someone is seriously ill, that they be killed. So our culture's changing quickly and dangerously. I do want to spend a little time talking about how some of these things come about and the nature of this battle. I talked earlier about the film Arrival. In the film Arrival, as I said, we'll talk about film and we'll talk about different aspects of the culture. It's a very interesting film. A lot of people will view it as a science fiction. I enjoyed the language aspects, and those of you who see it will recognize that right off. I also appreciated specifically the underlying message that language impacts how we view reality, that the use of language has so much control over our thought process that unless we fight that, we can consciously end up making decisions that are bad because we're not thinking in the most appropriate way. And this movie is just one of many cultural books, movies, songs. There's many examples of this, but I think that the film Arrival got to something even deeper. As I said, Paul in the book of Romans says to not be conformed to the thinking of your day-to-day life, the day-to-day world around you. Be careful of that, but instead be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Your mind needs to be renewed. There's a perspective you have to bring. And one that this movie actually touches on is that eternal things, past, the future, they're very important. And I want to say this, that you and I live in time, but we also live in eternity. That time is a portion of eternity. So you're in eternity right now. In the same sense that if you're in Stockton, California, you're still in the United States. You don't have to travel or wait until someday you get to Washington, D.C. That's not the heaven of the United States. You don't have to go to Washington, D.C. to be in the United States. If you're in Stockton, California, you're already in the United States. So when you are in your day-to-day life, you are actually in eternity right now. So it'll pay off. If you pay attention to eternal things, it's going to help you in day-to-day life. And that's what Paul is saying, have that perspective. Interestingly enough, in this film Arrival, that's one of the themes that's hidden in there. It is hidden, I'll admit, but you'll get it if you watch. I think it's very, very important that we understand that our language forms how we view life around us. And that movie does a pretty good job of at least suggesting that. As I said, we talk about films and entertainment both for good and for ill, and we'll always refer to those in our show notes. Something else happened in 2016, and that's with China, that the nation of China has announced that it has a new propaganda campaign, which is kicking off in 2017. And the propaganda campaign is actually something called soft power media. This fascinated me because the Chinese government, yes, they're still communist. But more to the point, they want to get their message across to the rest of the world, the Western world, if you will, the same way that the Western world communicates, which is through media, soft media. And this occurred to me that they're propagandizing, but I've been propagandized by the Western media for a long time. It's the most effective way to propagandize. So they have 6 new television stations. They're going to use social media. They're going to get their worldview and their message across to you and me. And I was fascinated that the Chinese government has made this decision because it's just confirming what we already know. We're already subject to ideas out to influence us. And if you're not prepared to recognize them in your own mind and to renew your mind and weigh things out, you can be talked into things without knowing it. So it's very important to weigh out what's coming at you, and China has just given us an example of that. They're going to use film, they're going to use television, they're going to use computers, and that's what's already impacting us day to day to day. There's one other thing about Chinese I want to mention. As I said, my background is in linguistics. I'm fascinated by language and the power of language. You may not know this about Chinese as a language, but several languages of that family, the Sinitic language family, in that part of the world, they don't have what we would call a subjunctive mood. And that's when we in English and many Western languages have this. That's when you use words like should, would, could, might, the kind of if, the what if approach to language, which we do use a lot. And I was fascinated as I looked into that and had some discussions with some friends that are interested in those languages. I think that might contribute to the reason that often, and we've seen this phenomenon, that families from cultures that speak Asian languages, they're very, very practical. And that's because their language is only in what we would call the indicative. And that's when you say, I'm going to the store. That's very straightforward and indicative. But they don't have a way of saying, maybe I should go to the store. Do you think we ought to go to the store? That concept of ought, should, possibly, that they don't use that voice. They don't use the subjunctive mood. And that to me is quite fascinating. Another book you may want to look into when it comes to government and language. Again, on this program, we're listening to Life Matters. The program is about culture. It's about life and the battle of ideas. And the right to life is a specific idea. It's a cultural idea that refers to the law. As you've heard before, it refers to, as our founders spelled out, the ultimate purpose of government is to protect your rights. Your right to be alive is the first and foremost. That's what the right to life is. It's a legal right. So it's important that when you see that ideas that are enforced become laws, we have to recognize this great challenge. And back in 1948, a gentleman wrote a book called 1984. And George Orwell, many of you may have read that. If you haven't read it, I don't say you have to. But if you have a chance, I suggest that you read the epilogue. The latter part of the book, he describes the language of Newspeak. And in Newspeak, he makes clear that those cultural elites at that time in that fictional world wanted to control how people think. And the way they did it was through the use of language. Yes, they did use a telescreen, and this was before the television was invented, but he saw the power of the moving picture. Movies were around, and George Orwell saw the power of the moving picture on people's thinking. And the telescreen was very, very important to how people got their ideas, and they're important to how you get your ideas. So don't believe everything you see on television. Make sure you weigh it out. But in Newspeak, he talks about the use of language and how it would limit people's view of reality, such that they didn't have a word liberty. They didn't have that word. And even should you give them that word, the concept of liberty would evade them. They didn't understand what it might mean. And I've met people like that today. They don't understand that the purpose of liberty is to be free of government control of your life. They think that liberty means I get to do whatever I feel like doing. And that gets us back to emotions. They equate liberty with their own personal emotions. They don't see that liberty is a reference to government function. And that's a real shame. So in a sense, Newspeak is already in effect. So get a chance, read George Orwell's portion on Newspeak, and you'll see how it does impact the way we think and how we have to guard ourselves. Again, you're listening to Life Matters, and I want to remind you that this is about renewing your mind and the battle of ideas, that you want to renew your mind as much as possible to think about that which really matters. Eternal things matter. And if you want to participate with us, please go to our 800 number, 800-924-2490. Leave a message there, and we'll try to play it on the air when we get a chance. And we want to remind you that you make an impact. If every life matters, that means you do too. So make sure that you get involved in the battle and do your part, because life matters.
Learn more about everything in today's show online at lifematters.life, where you'll find all the resources you need to protect life. Subscribe to the Life Matters podcast, where we have even more information on this and all the life issues. Go to lifematters.life to subscribe.